you dispute the characterization that you called folks who would oppose those voting bills as being Bull Connor or George Wallace, but you said that they would be sort of in the same camp.
No, I didn't say that. Look what I said. Go back and read what I said and tell me if you think I called anyone who voted on the side of the position taken by Bull Connor that they were Bull Connor. And that is an interesting reading of English. I assume you got into journalism because you like to write.
Wow. President Biden responding to questions about his voter bill speech last week in Georgia. Here are some of those comments and his defense.
At consequential moments in history, they present a choice. Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis?
Anybody who listened to the speech, I did not say that there were going to be a George Wallace or a Bull Connor. I said we're going to have a decision in history that is going to be marked just like it was then. You either voted on the side, that didn't make you George Wallace or didn't make you Bull Connor. But if you did not vote for the Voting Rights Act back then, you were voting with those who agreed with Connor.
RealClearPolitics White House reporter Philip Wegmann is the guy who asked the president about those statements during the Wednesday press conference, or at least he tried to. Philip joins us now. He got a little angry at you. Why?
Well, this is a sensitive president, and clearly he doesn't appreciate scrutiny on the speech that he gave in Georgia. So when I asked him about the Bull Connor and George Wallace comparison, he erupted before I could actually ask my question, which was, how does he expect to work with Republicans after he's laid out that binary? And frankly, the White House, they don't want to relitigate that speech at this point. And it is kind of a moot point because Republicans are walking away thinking that the president did compare them to segregationists. And frankly, it didn't work. It didn't sway Senators Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema to vote for the voting rights bills that he has supported thus far.
Yeah, if you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, I guess is the thing my mom might have said. He just got so testy with you and didn't even allow you to finish the question.
Yeah, and you sort of expect that whenever you're talking to any president, and clearly I don't have to tell you this. I mean, when you talk to any politician and you point back to some of their words, occasionally that can get underneath their skin. But I don't think that anyone is crying any tears for me because the president was a little bit gruff. If the president wants to get testy during press conferences, that's totally fine, so long as he has press conferences. And I was glad to have the opportunity in his just second solo press conference at the White House.
Yeah. Then there are also questions that the White House press team had to clean up about the president's statement on the legitimacy of the upcoming elections, suggesting that, if the election law that the Senate rejected, the election bill that the Senate rejected, that he wanted passed, if that wasn't passed, he said the 2022 elections might not be legitimate, and then the White House had to go into all kinds of damage control over that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the president was asked whether or not he thought that the upcoming midterms were going to be legitimate. And certainly the White House is expecting a bit of a shellacking coming up in those midterms. But I don't think anyone thought that the president was going to say what he did, which is that he thinks that it depends on whether or not he could get those laws through the Senate. And so when I followed up with him just a short time later to ask about the legitimacy of the 2022 midterms, he told me it could easily be illegitimate. And then he started talking about former President Trump and some of the things that we saw last January. I steered the conversation back to the 2022 midterms specifically, and the president told me in no uncertain terms that he wasn't ready to say that it could be legit. The walk back did not come from the White House until the next day.
Yeah, the former president, President Trump, likes to say that the 2020 elections were not legitimate. Joe Biden says they were, but now flips forward to 2022 and says they might not be. voters have to feel a little queasy about going to the booth.
Yeah, and this administration has been making an argument for some time that democracy itself is at stake. And while the White House press secretary clarified the president's statements on Twitter, here on Fox News during an interview, and several times in the briefing, saying that he does in fact believe that those midterm elections will be legitimate, that came after Vice President Harris dodged on the question twice during 2 early morning interviews, and also after House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, the guy who is probably most responsible for making President Biden president, he was asked on CNN whether or not he was concerned about the legitimacy of those midterms, and he responded that he absolutely was concerned.
The president spent, some time talking about the situation on the border between Russia and Ukraine, but did not address the situation on our southern border, where fentanyl, for instance, is flooding across and killing record numbers of Americans.
Yeah, and I think that might be something that the press has to own up on. Certainly, there were a lot of questions about what was happening on the Ukrainian border, and that is a legitimate issue, and all of the questions that were asked were certainly worthy. But after the press conference, I think it was Fox News' Bill Belugan who noted that there wasn't a single question asked about what was going on the southern border. And as you noted, there also weren't any questions about fentanyl, which is quickly becoming the leading cause of death for adults in the United States between the ages of 18 and 34. Likewise, the topic of rising crime in cities across the country didn't come up. And I think that, as members of the press, we need to sort of own up to that omission. For me, though, certainly I'm not immune from that criticism. My aim, though, was quickly to get him to follow up on the legitimacy question, because I thought that was fundamental. But certainly there were other questions that did not go addressed and probably should have.
You certainly made some news in talking to the president this week. We'll see what happens the next time he holds a news conference. Philip Wegmann, RealClearPolitics White House reporter. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.